Somewhere, right now, you're following a rule you never actually chose. A standard of what's right, what's acceptable, what a good person does. And if you trace that standard back far enough, you'd find that you didn't build it. You inherited it from your parents, your culture, your religion, your feed. And the strange part isn't that you inherited it. The strange part is how rarely you've ever stopped to ask whether it's actually yours. Here's the uncomfortable question underneath that. If every value you hold was handed to you by someone else, is any of it really your character? Or are you just a very convincing performance of the people who raised you? Sit with that for a second, because most people never do. Most people go their entire lives mistaking inherited rules for personal conviction. They call it having morals. They call it being a good person. But there's a difference between living by a standard you have actually examined and chosen, and living by a standard you simply absorbed because questioning it felt dangerous or disloyal or exhausting. This is the discomfort that sits at the center of one of philosophy's most misunderstood ideas, an idea that has been turned into a t-shirt slogan, stripped of its meaning, and handed back to us as an excuse for selfishness. The phrase is beyond good and evil, and almost nobody who repeats it actually understands what it was asking of them. Think about how much of your daily behavior runs on autopilot morality. You feel guilty for resting, so you call busyness a virtue. You feel afraid of conflict, so you call avoidance keeping the peace. You feel uncomfortable standing out, so you call conformity being humble. None of these are neutral facts about the universe. They're inherited scripts, dressed up as timeless truths, and most of us never once ask who wrote them or why. And this is where it gets personal, because the cost of never asking is not abstract. It shows up as the job you stay in, because leaving would look irresponsible to people whose opinion you don't even respect. It shows up as the relationship you don't leave, because your culture told you loyalty matters more than honesty with yourself. It shows up as the ambition you quietly abandoned, because somewhere you learned that wanting too much makes you arrogant, and arrogance is a sin. You didn't choose that belief. You absorbed it, and it's been running your life ever since, quietly in the background, like software you never agreed to install. Friedrich Nietzsche spent much of his philosophical life trying to expose exactly this. Writing in the late 19th century, in a Europe still shaped by centuries of religious and social convention, he set out to do something almost nobody had dared to do before him. He didn't just ask whether specific moral rules were right or wrong. He asked a more dangerous question underneath that one. Where did our entire idea of good and evil actually come from, and whose interest did it originally serve? In 1886, he published a book called Beyond Good and Evil, and the title alone was a provocation. He wasn't proposing a world without ethics, a world of chaos where anything goes. That's the shallow, t-shirt version of the idea, and it misses the point entirely. What he was proposing was something far more demanding. He was asking his readers to move beyond inherited, unexamined categories of moral judgment, to stop treating good and evil as fixed truths handed down from above, and start asking where those categories came from, who benefited from them, and whether they still deserved authority over your one unrepeatable life. Nietzsche traced much of conventional morality back to what he called a slave morality, a system of values that, in his interpretation, emerged from resentment, from the position of the weak looking up at the strong and redefining strength itself as something suspicious, even sinful. Humility, self-denial, meekness, elevated not necessarily because they were the highest human qualities, but because they were useful to those who lacked power and comforting to those who feared people who had it. He contrasted this with what he called a master morality, rooted not in resentment of others, but in a direct, self-authored sense of what is noble, what is worth pursuing, what a strong and flourishing life actually looks like. Now, here's where the real problem begins, because it would be easy to hear this and think Nietzsche was simply glorifying dominance, or dismissing compassion as weakness. That reading is not just simplistic. It's a distortion history has never fully forgiven him for, partly because his own sister mishandled his writings after his death and allowed them to be twisted toward ends he never intended. Nietzsche was not asking you to become cruel. He was asking you to become honest. Honest enough to notice when your kindness is a genuine expression of strength and when it's actually fear wearing a gentle mask. This is the part most people never fully understand. The goal was never the abolition of values. It was the transformation of where those values come from. Nietzsche's deepest concern wasn't that people had morals. It was that most people had never actually chosen theirs. They had simply received a finished moral system, the way you'd receive a hand-me-down coat, and worn it their entire lives without ever asking if it fit. So what would it actually mean to live beyond good and evil, in the sense Nietzsche meant it? It would mean examining every should in your life and asking a brutally honest question. Is this something I actually believe is right, after real reflection? Or is this something I follow because I'm afraid of what happens if I don't? Why do people stay quiet in rooms where they disagree? Not because they lack opinions, but because disagreement risks the group's approval, and approval has been trained into us for tens of thousands of years as a matter of survival. Why do people chase careers that impress others but hollow them out inside? Because somewhere along the way, impressive got quietly substituted for meaningful, and almost nobody noticed the swap. Why do people feel guilty for wanting more out of life, even when what they want harms no one? Because ambition itself has been coded in certain corners of our culture as something slightly indecent, as though wanting greatly were a character flaw rather than a form of honesty about your own potential. This is where Nietzsche's insight becomes even more disturbing when you apply it to yourself directly. Because the question is no longer just where did my morality come from? The question becomes, how much of my personality is actually me, and how much of it is a defense mechanism I built to avoid disapproval? Underneath the polite compliance, underneath the well-behaved life, there's often a person who has never once asked what they would choose to value if no one else were watching and no one else would ever find out. That gap between the self you present and the self you would be if fear were removed from the equation is where an enormous amount of quiet suffering lies. Because you cannot build a genuinely meaningful life out of values you've never examined. You can build a comfortable one. You can build one that other people approve of. But comfort and approval are not the same thing as meaning. And Nietzsche believed that most people spend their entire lives confusing the two, right up until the moment they run out of time to correct it. Here is where everything changes, though, because Nietzsche did not leave his readers in the rubble of everything they used to believe. He offered something in its place, not a new set of rules to obey, but a responsibility to create. He used a phrase that has since become one of his most famous and most misunderstood: the idea of becoming who you are. Not discovering some pre-written destiny, but actively building a self through the values you choose, the standards you hold, and the life you're willing to earn through struggle rather than simply inherit through obedience. This is not the same as saying, just do whatever you want. That reading again mistakes freedom from inherited morality for freedom from all discipline. And Nietzsche demanded more discipline from his readers, not less. Creating your own values is harder than following someone else's, not easier. It requires you to actually think, to test your beliefs against real consequence, to notice when you're rationalizing weakness as virtue, and to hold yourself to a standard higher than mere social acceptability, a standard you can actually defend to yourself in the silence of your own mind, with no one else in the room to perform for. So what does this look like in practice, in an ordinary life, far from any philosophy seminar? It starts with noticing. Before your next moral judgment about yourself or someone else, before the next I should, or that's wrong, or good people don't do that, pause and ask where the rule came from. not to dismiss it automatically, but to actually interrogate it. Some inherited values will survive that interrogation and come out stronger, now genuinely yours instead of merely borrowed. Others will not survive it, and that is not a loss. That is the entire point. It continues with distinguishing your compassion from your fear. Real compassion moves toward another person's well-being because you have chosen it as a value. Fear-based niceness moves away from conflict because confrontation feels dangerous. They can look identical from the outside, and only you, in the privacy of your own honesty, can tell which one is actually driving your behavior. It requires learning to tolerate disapproval without immediately reorganizing your beliefs around it. Not because other people's opinions never matter. They do, especially the people who have earned your respect through their own integrity. But there is a difference between updating your views because you've encountered a better argument and abandoning your views because you've encountered discomfort. Confusing the two keeps people small for their entire lives. And it means accepting that a self-created standard is a heavier burden than an inherited one, not a lighter one. When your values come from outside you, failure is someone else's fault. The rules were unfair, the system was rigged, the expectations were unreasonable. When your values are genuinely your own, you lose that excuse. You become fully responsible for the life those values produce. That responsibility is exactly what Nietzsche believed most people quietly, unconsciously spend their lives avoiding. This is the real climax of the idea, the part that gives it its weight. Living beyond good and evil was never an invitation to escape morality. It was an invitation to earn it, to stop being a passenger in your own conscience and start being its author, to trade the false safety of inherited rules for the far more demanding, far more honest work of deciding deliberately who you're going to be and then living in a way that could actually withstand your own scrutiny in the one courtroom that ultimately matters, which is the quiet, unwatched moments of your own mind. You will not solve this in one afternoon. Nietzsche never promised anyone that this work ends. But somewhere in your life, right now, there's a value you've been obeying without ever having chosen it. A standard you meet not because you believe in it, but because breaking it feels unthinkable. Find that one. Look directly at it. Ask whether it deserves the authority you've been giving it. That single question, asked honestly, is where a self-authored life actually begins. Not in comfort, not in approval, but in the quiet, demanding decision to finally take responsibility for the standards you live by and to stop mistaking what you inherited for who you actually are.